You are listening to That Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding. Learn about hoarding disorder from me, somebody who has it. I promote a better understanding of hoarding disorder, a stigmatised mental health condition that is mocked rather than treated with compassion. I want to change that, and by talking openly and honestly about hoarding, I hope to start conversations that help. Find out how to support the podcast at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support. Finally, I am not a doctor. I'm just a hoarder doing her best. So do seek professional support if and when you need it. Hey, how are you? I am tired. I'm really tired, but I'm okay. I would like to say I was raring to go. That would not be true, but I am okay.
Let's start with some housekeeping.
So, one bit of housekeeping this week. Next Friday is the next de-hoarding accountability session. We had the third one last Sunday, and it was so good. It was really good. There was 6 or 7 of us, and we chatted as we went. We all got on with our individual things. Some people said a lot, some people said a little, but it was a really nice atmosphere and just great to be in the company of other hoarders. So thank you to everybody who's come to one so far. If you would like to come to the next one next Friday or any of the ones after that, head to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/ticket, and I hope to see you there. So today I'm talking about analysis paralysis, which is when you get so overwhelmed by your options that you just freeze. You can't do anything. You get so overwhelmed by the possibilities or the general situation that rather than tackling any of it, you just freeze. And obviously this can be a giant issue for people who hoard. We live in overwhelming situations. And so being able to tackle any of it can be quite hard if we look around us and try to work out which is the best bit to do. If I do that bit, maybe that would be quicker, but if I do that bit, I'd be able to get to that cupboard. But if I do that, I would have to do this first. And maybe I should do that actually, because then this. And we just become paralyzed by overanalysing. And one of my early podcast episodes was about one method of tackling analysis paralysis. And that was by having what I call systems. That's basically having certain rules in place so that you don't have to make a decision every time about a particular category. I can't bear to re-listen to those old episodes, but I do remember that I talked about, for me, one of those is that if food is out of date, it goes. I don't have to, in a house of a million decisions to make, when it comes to food, if I check the date and it's out of date, I don't have to make a decision because I already long ago made the decision that I deserve better than out-of-date food. I made the decision that out-of-date food felt risky for me to eat. And so I made a decision that if food was out of date, I wasn't going to eat it. And if I wasn't going to eat it, it may as well go in the bin. And so it's like a shortcut that saves me just some of the many decisions we have to make when we're de-hoarding. And we can apply these kind of systems in all kinds of ways. It can be things like if clothes are too big or too small, they go. Just full stop. And it saves you agonizing over every item of clothing. And that can be a really effective way of reducing some of that analysis paralysis. But in today's episode, I'm going to look at some more ideas as well, because analysis paralysis is it gets in deep and really interrupts when we're trying to make progress, but we just get really stuck. And so when you are dealing with that situation where you're so overwhelmed that you just freeze and you don't know what to do, it's important to remind yourself you are not aiming for perfect. Aiming for perfect, first of all, is pointless, because whatever we do, whatever we achieve, it can't all be perfect. And the truth is that aiming for perfect, what it really does is just completely either make us freeze altogether, or do things so slowly, or do things with such a high difficulty level that we can't make any amount of progress. It is hard to aim for good enough if you are deep down a perfectionist. But I have certain things I say to myself when I find myself being perfectionist about something and that making me freeze. One is, now is better than perfect. Another is, done is better than perfect. If they, as little mantras, don't work, I remind myself that I'm human and can't and probably shouldn't try to do everything perfectly. I remind myself that trying to do things perfectly just leads to self-recrimination, because I invariably don't. Or more often, maybe, it leads to not starting in the first place. You can't fail if you don't try, which is not even true, but that's kind of the fear that takes over our brain. So that mindset of perfectionism can be a real cause of analysis paralysis. And so one thing you can do is just try and identify when that's happening. If you feel paralyzed and you can't take action, have a look into what that is. Ask yourself a few questions. And if the thing that is making you freeze is, I won't be able to do this right, or I won't be able to do this perfectly, take a step back. Remember that it doesn't have to be done perfectly. It just has to be done. And the way we improve at these things is by doing them, by practicing them, by learning as we go. We can't go into it perfect. And if we never try, we will never get better. And a similar mindset thing to perfectionism is also looking at uncertainty. Are you scared of not having a certain outcome to your situation? Are you scared of doing something because you're not quite sure? Are you anxious at the prospect of trying something new? How will it go? What will I feel like? What will it be like? What if I put this in the bin and then I later find out I could have recycled it? What if I recycle this and I later found out I could have sold it on eBay? What if I sell this on eBay and somebody buys it for £5 and then resells it for £5,000? Whatever those kind of uncertainty fears are that can really plague our brains, it can also really cause us to become paralyzed. And it is so hard, but making ourselves face the fact that we can't always have all the information. We can't always find out every eventuality. We can't always get it right. This is why it's linked with perfectionism. And often, again, like with perfectionism, with uncertainty, we have to take the leap and do our best with what we've got. It doesn't mean we have to be reckless. It doesn't mean we have to not care about the consequences at all. But it does mean that we have to accept that life is full of uncertainty, and that is unsettling, and it can be distressing and difficult. But it is how things are. And sometimes we have to make a decision without all the information, or without the best information, or without somebody else telling us what to do. And that is okay. And sometimes we'll get it wrong, and that's also okay. All we can do is our best with the information and resources we've got. And if we become obsessed by looking up every book we want to get rid of on Amazon to see how much the second-hand copies are selling for, but we've got 3,500 books, that's not proportionate. We get stuck. Reframing the fear of not getting it right and the fear of uncertainty in our brains can really help. So you're changing the question from what if it goes wrong to what if it's great? Or you're changing the question from what if it goes wrong to how will I feel if I achieve this? Not perfectly, but just it's done. Sometimes asking a different question can kickstart our brain a bit when we are stuck and paralysed. Like when Jasmine Slay was a guest. We were talking about this in the last Accountability Zoom sesh, actually. The way she reframed one big question in her work as a professional organiser is a lot of us get very scared of what if we give something away or get rid of something and regret it. And she really focuses on the fact that in her years of experience as a professional organiser working with people who hoard, in her experience, we find things when we sort through stuff. We find things that we thought we had lost forever or that we had forgotten we ever had far more often than we regret getting rid of something. So actually the process of dehoarding is more one of gaining than losing. And that kind of reframing I find really helpful. And especially if the root of your analysis paralysis is perfectionism or a fear of uncertainty. If you've been wondering how you can support the podcast, there are more ways than just by donating. It really, really helps if you leave a review, share the podcast with your friends or on social media, link to the podcast from your website, or just follow me on social media and send me the occasional hi. Find out more at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support. More practical approaches to analysis paralysis are available as well as the mindset stuff. So in terms of getting yourself to take action rather than sit in a heap thinking about how you can't take action, there are some great tips as well that can help. And one is time limits. Now, I've talked before about how I find imposing deadlines on myself generally not super effective. There's the odd exception, but I can't convince my brain that a deadline that I have set is a real deadline. It works for some people, in which case, brilliant, go for it. But there are some occasions it does work, but there's also the option of time limits in a different way. So rather than a deadline, it's things like setting a timer for 20 minutes and in 20 minutes the alarm will go off. It generates something of a focus in your mind and a bit of a sense of urgency. But that focus of, okay, I've got 20 minutes, what can I do, is really beneficial when you're in that state of analysis paralysis. Because instead of so many vast options being available to you, you've only got 20 minutes of options, and it focuses your mind a bit and it makes it less overwhelming because you're not looking at your entire house and years of work. You're looking at the next 20 minutes. What can I achieve? What can I do? It makes me think of that saying, if you want something done, give it to a busy person. You know, if you've got an endless space of hours and hours and hours in front of you, it's hard to get it done. If you've got 20 minutes, you just kind of have to get going. Another thing that helps you to take action when you are in analysis paralysis is practicing with small, tiny decisions. If you feel like you just don't have the confidence in yourself to make the decisions you need to make to dehoard your home, start with tiny stuff that really doesn't matter, kind of incidental. So if you somehow get it wrong, it doesn't matter at all. That can be things like, do I use the white rubbish bags or the yellow rubbish bags? Doesn't matter at all. But if you're overwhelmed, you're making a little choice and proving to yourself that you can make a decision. You can start on items that you find relatively easy to get rid of, which of course is different for everybody. But as I said, one of mine is out-of-date food. Another of mine is stuff that I consider to be obvious rubbish. Again, what even obvious rubbish is will vary from person to person. But for me, an empty Pepsi Max bottle, that can go. I have no attachment to that. I have no real dilemma over that. And so starting with the real low stakes decisions that you know you are very unlikely to regret helps you in two ways. One is it helps you to build that de-hoarding muscle. Like, imagine if you've been in a coma for a year and you haven't moved, and then you wake up and you're trying to learn, your body's trying to learn to go about life again. But in a year, you haven't used any of those muscles. You don't start by running a marathon. You start maybe by wiggling your toes. And that might take ages and it might be really painful because you haven't wiggled your toes for a year. But you start there. And then when you can wiggle your toes, maybe you try wiggling your fingers. And just like if you were starting physical movement from scratch, you would start tiny. If you are really struggling to dehoard, or you've never tried to do it, or you feel like you don't know how to do it, starting with those little low stakes decisions really helps to build those muscles so that eventually you can sit up, and then eventually you can walk, and then eventually, maybe run a marathon if that's what you want to do. But the other reason starting with low stakes decisions is good, as well as it building the muscle, is it builds your confidence. If you currently believe that you can't start because you have no idea what you're doing, you have no clue. First of all, I don't believe that you have no idea what you're doing or you have no clue, but you may. So starting with low stakes, tiny decisions also helps to build your confidence. So you make a tiny decision and it's actually fine. And then that might spur you on to make another tiny decision, which is fine. And then you might be able to make a slightly bigger decision. So you're building the muscle and you're building your confidence at the same time. If your analysis paralysis is focused on worrying about future you, what if the consequences of me giving this away are terrible? Or if you are preoccupied with mistakes you believe you've made in the past. And so either of those, whether it's looking to the past or looking to the future, is making you paralyzed in the decisions you're trying to make now. Trying really hard to bring yourself back to now, bring yourself back to the present, is a hard thing to do. But if you can nail it, it's really useful because you can remind yourself, first of all, this isn't the same as decisions I've made in the past because I'm making this decision now. I have different information available to me now than I had then. I have more experience now than I had then. I'm making this decision now. What I did before doesn't matter. Or if you can bring yourself back to now and think, I'm doing my best with this now. I hope I won't regret it in the future. But all I've got is now. And so I've got to make this decision now because the future's the future and I have little control over a lot of it. So trying to ground yourself in the present, if you find yourself preoccupied by either past or future consequences, can be a good exercise when you are paralyzed by that overthinking around other periods of time. You're not a time traveler. You've got now. A really good one for analysis paralysis is breaking it down into smaller chunks. I often find that when I'm overwhelmed by a task, what that means is I've bitten off too much and I make it smaller. And if I'm still overwhelmed, I make it smaller still. And so, whereas I used to go, I need to dehoard my house, and then understandably just go, well, that's impossible, and not even try. And then I would go, I need to dehoard my bedroom, and again, impossible. But once I learnt that going, I need to dehoard this that's in front of me right now. I need to sort through this pile of letters. I need to take out 3 bags of rubbish. I need to clear this surface. It gets rid of a lot of that panic that overwhelm can bring that does make us shut down. Because how on earth do you dehoard a whole house? It's a really big question. How do I sort out this cutlery drawer? Okay, maybe I can do that. Or maybe that's still too big. And you can say, I'm going to make sure all my forks are in the same place. And if that's still too big and too overwhelming, look at whatever small task you've broken it down to and work out just what the first step is. Okay, so the task is put all the forks together. What would the first thing I would need to do be to put all the forks together? I would need to open the cutlery drawer. Or maybe the cutlery drawer's already open and you're staring at it in panic. Maybe it would just be pick up all the visible forks and start there. And if you can identify what that first step could be, I'm not going to say should be because it would be different for different people. It's easier and so much less overwhelming to go, well, pick up all the forks I can see in this drawer. I mean, I can do that. And then once you've got 6 forks in your hand, It might be that you can see other forks, so you can add those to what you're holding. Or it might be that you think, okay, I've got forks in my hand. What I need to do is put the forks down so I can look for more. The next step might well just come intuitively. So focusing on the first one can help you get started. And often, once you've done that first step and you've got that movement, that motion happening, your brain and your body and your soul combine and go, okay, I can do this. It's the getting going that's really, really scary. I also want to talk about something called a decision-making framework. And there are different types of decision-making frameworks, but they relate a bit to what I was saying at the top about systems. And it's basically having a series of criteria or a process to go through that helps you make decisions to break through that analysis paralysis. And these can be as simple as a list of pros and cons. When I was a kid, if I couldn't decide something, my parents would often give me a piece of paper and a pen and have me write a list of pros and cons. And sometimes just that makes it really obvious what the right thing to do is. Another might be that setting criteria. So, is the food out of date? Do the clothes fit? It helps you step out of an emotional panic state and more into a logical, okay, I have a process for this state. Other decision-making tools that can really help are things like asking for advice sometimes that can help beyond decision-making and with a lot more elements of analysis paralysis. Don't ask everybody for input on everything. That's another kind of, it will either slow you down or it will make you grind to a halt altogether. If you have to consult 12 people on every pencil, you won't go anywhere. But if you're really, really stuck, think, who do I know who would be able to make this decision for themselves? You don't even have to say, I am having a really big dilemma about how many pairs of socks I should own. You can just say to your friend, to your sister, out of interest, how many pairs of socks do you own? And it can just give you a kind of a guiding starting point. Okay, my sister owns 12 pairs of socks. I own 47 pairs of socks. Maybe I have too many socks. With decision-making frameworks, it's not about adding an extra process to go through when you're trying to make progress in your home. Don't let them become a chore that you force yourself through. But when you're really stuck, something like a pros and cons list, something like a cost benefit analysis, if you're that, if your brain works that way, something like a rule about I can only keep pens that work, saves some decisions and frees up your mind for the decisions that do genuinely need a bit of thought and that may genuinely be a bit more emotional or feel a bit more fraught in one way or another. Remind yourself that practice helps with all of this. There are things I am absolutely convinced I cannot do. And if I can use these kind of tips and start doing them, maybe in a really unwieldy, slow, difficult way, with no confidence in what I'm doing, quite often when I look at the things I can do, I realise I started off going, it's impossible, and then progressed to, this is slow and unwieldy and really difficult. And somewhere along the line, I became roughly able to do it. And so even if you think you can't, even if you think it's too hard, even if you think it's impossible, when you are paralyzed because you are overthinking, because you are being perfectionist, things like reminding yourself that progress is the most important thing, things like asking yourself strategic questions like, what will I gain if I can manage this? Things like saying, I don't know for sure how this will turn out, but I'll do my best. Things like setting a timer. Things like joining an accountability Zoom session to de-hoard with other people. Things like starting tiny. Things like reminding yourself that now is what you've got. The past is done and it can inform us, but if it's holding us back, that's really makes everything harder. And if we're scared of what the future will bring and that's holding us back, that makes everything harder. And so trying to come back to now, things like breaking tasks down, things like working out just what the first thing you have to do is, things like limiting the options you've got in front of you, things like pros and cons lists, things like having set criteria, things like remembering it's all practice. They can just break through some of those mechanisms we've got that are protective, but in a misguided way. And so when we are paralyzed and stuck, these are things we can look at to think, which of these feels the most relevant to this particular problem, and give them a try. Progress, practice, progress, not perfection. So shout out to a podcast called Declutter Your Life. And this bit of advice I found really interesting. Have a listen.
There are days when just not making more mess is good enough. You know when those days are. I mean, you need a mental health day, you need a day off, but it's only a day off. It's not a week off. It's not a month off. It's not, it's been 3 months since I X, Y, or Z. I put my keys away, or I found my mobile phone at the first time when I was looking for it, or I knew where the paper towels were, or whatever it might be. The individual example is not as important as the concept, which I hope that you're getting from this. There are days when it will be okay to just not make more mess. That isn't a get out of jail free card. It doesn't give you a pass to just phone it in. You know in your heart of hearts whether you are really puny or you're just letting yourself off the hook. We talk in another episode of the podcast about external accountability. So avail yourself of accountability when you need it. And if you need the day off, give yourself permission for the day off. You don't have to beat up on yourself. You don't need to shame yourself or humiliate yourself or start to tell any of your 200 lies about, what a fuck up you are, or like you can't do anything, right? If on that day off, you start to talk in absolutes like, I never get anything done, this always happens to me, that should be a red flag to you that you are definitely telling one of your 200 lies, and you need to knock that crap off. But on those days when you just need to order in some food and curl up on the sofa and watch Netflix, as long as when you're done doing that, you put the empty food containers, you rinse them out and put them in the recycle bin, or you throw them away. You put the remote control back where the remote control goes. You fold up the Afghan and put it on the back of the sofa or where it lives, and you take your mobile phone and charge it or put it where it belongs. That day is a zero-sum day. You didn't make more mess. You didn't move the needle forward, but you didn't create a bigger problem for yourself tomorrow. That, for me, can be a win of a day. We don't always need to be living at peak performance.
I think there are bits of truth in there that we could all probably learn from. Okay, I will link to Declutter Your Life in the show notes at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. And thank you for listening, and I will speak to you soon. Thank you for listening to That Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you on board. You can find all the links I've mentioned and a transcript of the episode online at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. To find out more about how you can support this podcast and the overall project, go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support and do subscribe to the podcast so you make sure you don't miss any future episodes. There may be links in this podcast that earn me money. This doesn't come at any extra cost to you if you make a purchase through those links, and it helps to support the podcast. I am pushing through. No, cut that. That's a bit miserable. I am keeping going, and it's nearly the weekend. So, changing the question from, or you're changing the question from, what if